What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the King Crusoe YouTube channel and another episode of the Book Binge. This week, instead of another book review, I'm going to be doing a list video, in case you couldn't tell by the title. This week, I will be talking about the top 15 fantasy series that I haven't read yet, but I absolutely plan to read at some point in time, which I'll explain more as I talk about each series. I was originally planning this video to be a top 10 list and have a couple honorable mentions. Turns out I couldn't keep it quite that condensed. There were a few items that I wanted to add that I wasn't initially anticipating having on the list at the start. So it became a top 15 list. The long and short of my reading experiences is that I haven't read a whole lot of fantasy, particularly traditional fantasy or even Tolkien-esque fantasy. I just barely recently read Lord of the Rings, and before that I hadn't read much of anything that wasn't in the YA kind of spectrum of books, so there's going to be a lot of stuff on this list, hence why I couldn't narrow it down. There will be, well, for me myself actually, I would probably ask, where does sci-fi fall on this list? I'm not super into most sci-fi, but I want to be able to get into some stuff with it. There's not a whole lot of sci-fi book series that I know of that I'm interested in reading a whole lot of, but there are a couple series in this list that could technically be classified as sci-fi or something along those lines, maybe a little bit more than they would be considered fantasy, but to me I figure they're all close enough to be able to consider them to be the same thing and just bunch them all up into this fantasy video. Like I said, there's not enough sci-fi or other stuff like that for me to be able to talk about and put into a list of its own. It's all going to be here. Now, I suppose I should probably define what fantasy is going to be in this list, so I'm just going to say that it's all sorts of things. Basically, anything and everything will technically fit as fantasy under the criteria for my list here. It's not just going to be composed of your classic type of fantasy, or your medieval fantasy, or your Tolkien-esque fantasy. There's going to be plenty of stuff that a couple people probably wouldn't consider technically fantasy, more just normal fiction with a little bit of elements that might be used in some fantasy. So, with all of that being said, I believe I've talked about all the things that I need to, so let's move right on into the list. Hey guys, just wanted to pop in here and add a couple things to the list that I completely forgot to talk about. I know it's already a long video, but let me explain. One of these items I just completely forgot to put onto the original list for some reason. I don't know how it missed my mind when I was coming up with it, but I just completely forgot it, so I gotta add that one in. And then the other item I actually discovered like 3 days after I originally recorded this list, so it's not going to be in the original list anyway, but is now. So the first series that I want to add in here is The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. I've already read The Magician's Nephew, but that was like many years ago, probably in 6th grade or something like that, so 7 or 8 years ago at this point, and that one is the first of the 7 books chronologically, but I'm pretty sure it was the last of the 7 to be published. I always wanted to continue the series because, you know, the movies are very good. I love those movies, and the series is popular enough for a reason, so I am looking forward to reading this series at some point. It's looking like it's probably not going to be until the late 2020s, if then, but I'm still going to get around to this series at some point. I don't know how I forgot to add this series to the original list, but accidents just happen, I guess. And then the second series that I want to add is the Legacy Trilogy by Matthew Ward. Like I said, I didn't actually discover the series until a few days after I recorded the original video, and let me just say I'm super attracted to the covers of the series. They are very, very pretty covers. I know nothing about the series. I know nothing that happens in them. I don't even really know a synopsis of them, but they were kind of like an impulse buy for me when I saw them, but they were just so beautiful I couldn't pass them up, so I'm adding that to the list as well. That is actually scheduled, I believe, at the moment for like mid-2025, but we'll see how structured that schedule stays over the next several years as life events happen. Again, sorry for adding a few minutes onto this already very long video, but I felt obligated to add these in, so thanks for watching. Enjoy the rest of the video. At number 15 is the Trials of Apollo series by Rick Riordan. I'm going to move over a little bit so that I can include pictures right there. It is going to be the Trials of Apollo series at number 15 by Rick Riordan. I've already read the Percy Jackson series before, and I've read the Heroes of Olympus series before. Those are two series in the same timeline. My understanding is that Trials of Apollo takes place as a third series in that same timeline. And at the time of this release, on January 31st, I believe, I've already started my Great Riordan reread, with starting again from Percy Jackson, reading off the mythology-based stuff. Percy Jackson, Heroes of Olympus, King Chronicles, Magnus Chase, all stuff that I've already read before, except for the last Magnus Chase book. And then Trials of Apollo at the very end being the last series, one that I have not read at all. So I'm excited enough to get into that. It's been a little bit since I've read Riordan, but Riordan I have to credit with being the reason that I love to read in the first place, so it is very important to me that I include this book series on the list. At number 14, I have the Lorien Legacies Reborn trilogy, and to a lesser extent, the Lost Files novella collections. I've read the original Lorien Legacy series many years ago. I got probably about halfway through a reread before I fell out of love with reading. That was around that time of my life. And I will at some point be rereading the whole series again. So a few of the books I'll be reading my third time. The later ones I'll be reading my second time. But after or during my reread of that series, I'll be going through the Lost Files. But after I'm done with that reread, I'll finally read the Lorien Legacies Reborn sequel trilogy. That's one that I've wanted to read ever since the first one came out. And I just never got around to it because I wanted to reread the original series before I read it, and then I never finished that. So that's number 14. At number 13 is the Malazan Book of the Fallen series. It's a set of books with some really cool covers, both the original hardcovers I really like the mass market paperback editions that are more readily available. There are definitely some pretty cool covers. I know that this is one of those series that a lot of people who are really well versed and deep into the fantasy genre are like, you have to read this series. I'm well aware that it's a very dense series. It's one that new readers don't really understand. Even veteran readers don't really understand some of the things that go on in it. I have no plans whatsoever to read this series anytime soon at all. Not even a little bit. Don't get your hopes up. It'll be a long ways in the far future. It's not high priority, but it's one of those series that I'll keep my eye out for and decide to read them at some point in time. I've got a lot of other stuff that I want to read before I get to that. Number 12 is the Department 19 series by Will Hill. I don't know if I've been saying the authors of all these. That's fine. We all know that Stephen Erickson wrote Malazan and Pittacus Lore wrote Lorien Legacies. That's fine. So sorry about that. Number 12 is Department 19 by Will Hill. This is a series that I read a little bit of the first book. I want to say maybe the first quarter or maybe somewhere around there. I read that much of that first book many years ago. I want to say it was something like 8th grade, sometime around there. It's a vampire-based story. What I know or remember from it is it's kind of about a department of vampire hunters. My guess is that this side of vampires airs and leans a little bit more on the vampires are scary type of tropes and ideas a little bit more than the vampires are sexy kind of ideas and tropes, which is something that I find intriguing to know about. And it seems like a fun concept for vampire genre of having dedicated groups of people to hunt vampires and make sure that the real world doesn't know about them. I don't know how many of you have heard about the series. I doubt many have. I became interested because the covers looked cool in my high school library. So moving on to number 11 is the Redwall series by Brian Jacques. Now there's this animated version of this animated movie version of Redwall that came out in 2000, I think. My research showed that was just called Redwall, as far as I know. I absolutely adored that movie as a kid. I watched it so many times, still hold very fond memories for it. I absolutely loved that movie. It was so good. It was probably about 4th grade when I checked out the first Redwall book from my library to try to read it. It was a little bit above my skill reading level at the time. I didn't start going to public school until 3rd grade. I didn't even learn how to read until partway into 3rd grade. So my reading skills were definitely pretty low at this point in my life. But the fantastical ideas that are used in the Redwall series that I know of, just the main characters being like mice and rats and stuff like that, seems really cool to me for some reason. I really like that. Like, sure, I know that the series is a little bit more geared towards middle grade and young children, but it's still a series that I'd love to read at some point, even if I don't get to read them until at some point in the future if I had kids and I read them as bedtime stories or something like that. Either way, Redwall is a series that I want to read. I'm just so attracted to them for some reason. So that's number 11. And now we enter the top 10 part of the list, the final top 10. The next series at number 10 is The Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini. So my history with the series is, I'm pretty sure all of my middle school and high school, well, maybe not my high school friends. I didn't have many friends in high school, but most of my middle grade and middle school, junior high friends that I knew had read The Inheritance Cycle at some point. Some of them had read them as early as 3rd or 4th grade, which seems crazy to me. I was in 4th grade when I first saw these books. I was first introduced to them by my counselor at that time in 4th grade. She showed me the books and told me that a 16-year-old had written them, and I was dumbfounded by that. I was like, how can a 16-year-old write books this big? That is crazy. The size of them always daunted me. To a certain extent, they still do to this day, but I'm not super intimidated by long books anymore. However, the importance of my counselor showing me that was kind of cool and important. It kind of showed me and told me that I could really do anything that I wanted with my life. And it wasn't until a year later, somewhere around 5th grade, that Rick Riordan was the reason that I wanted to become an author. It's a lot of the reason why I do my writing. Seasonalproductions.com, by the way, is where you can get some of that. But I would definitely credit this series with being at least a little bit of the reason for sowing the seeds for my love of reading and writing, just because it seems so cool that a 16-year-old had written the series. So there's that at number 10. At number 9 is another series that most of my middle school and elementary school friends had read in 3rd and 4th and 5th grade somehow, is Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. This is a series that I think I read the first book, and I read a little bit of the second book. I want to say I was in 5th or 6th grade when I read these, and I didn't finish the second book. I got in a little bit of trouble with my mom. My mom was one of those people that didn't like the Harry Potter series, but that's fine. Either way, I read the first book. I enjoyed it a bit. I didn't get super into the second book because I just didn't attempt to read it after I got in trouble. So there's that. And for the same reason that I wasn't technically allowed to read the books, I have never watched the Harry Potter movies either. I've never watched the movies, but I do want to see what makes the series so popular, why J.K. Rowling is one of the, most well-known, popular, richest authors that there is. So there's that at number 9. At number 8, a big twist. The last couple of book series were a little bit geared towards younger readers to a certain extent. At number 8 is the, I think it's called The Second Apocalypse, by R. Scott Bakker, which is comprised of the Prince of Nothing and Aspect Emperor series. I know that these are grimdark, which is nothing that I'm super familiar with. I just know that they're super dark, super gritty books. And I think before a couple months ago, I had never heard of these books. But ever since I have heard of them, I know that I don't know if I've ever heard any bad things specifically about them. Just that they're really dark. And yeah, so there's that. I'm interested to read them. No plans anytime soon. But I am definitely intrigued by the idea of these books being super dark. So there's something there. Primarily, the series that I'm more interested in is Prince of Nothing, the initial trilogy. But if I enjoyed that, I would be happy to move on to Aspect Emperor. On a similar note, in a similar vein, at number 7 is the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. I know that there's more books and series and stuff in the First Law universe, but the First Law is what I'm going to include on this list. Similar to Prince of Nothing, it is also grimdark, I've heard, and that it can be pretty dark. It's also a series that I don't plan to read anytime soon, but it's definitely on my radar. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody say like any legitimately bad things about this series. So that's something that I'll keep an eye out for. I know that there are some versions of the trilogy that I think look really cool. There are some versions that I don't think look good at all, so, you know, that's just an aesthetic thing. As we get more into the higher tiers of this list, the way that the covers look play a little bit more of a role in how I feel about them. So there's that. And now coming in at number 6 is the Cosmere by Brandon Sanderson. So this is encompassed by a whole lot of different series. There's Elantris, there's Warbreaker, which are both standalones. I think Brandon has planned sequels for those at some point in time. But then there's the Stormlight Archive and the the Mistborn eras and whatnot. There's a lot that goes into the Cosmere, but all of it is stuff I'm interested in, but primarily the Stormlight Archives. When I do get around to reading stuff from the Cosmere, I will start with Elantris because I know it's his weakest, and I don't want to read, you know, like Stormlight Archive and then go back to Elantris and kind of suffer through that. I've heard that some people have had some pretty mediocre experiences doing something like that. I've watched a lot of live signing sessions and lectures of Brandon's for the past several months. He's a lot of the reason why I've been buckling down on a lot of my writing recently. Just listening to him talk and lecture about writing and different concepts and being open and also being really nice to people, just asking really basic questions about writing is something that I find really admirable. So I definitely want to read some of his writing, even though I haven't read any of it yet. So there's that. And now we get into the top contenders with the top 5. This one at number 5 probably wouldn't technically be considered fantasy. It's more of a sci-fi space opera, fantasy epic inspired type of series. I don't know exactly. The author can clarify a little bit more, but it's the Sun Eater series by Christopher Rocchio. Rocchio is somebody who I've interacted with on a few occasions in a Discord server. He's a really cool guy, and I own 2 copies of the first 3 books so far. Yes, 2. I own the UK signed edition of all 3 of them, and the first book is actually one with blue pages that looks really cool. And then I own the normal American edition. So, yeah, I mean, they seem like something that I'm sure I would really enjoy. Despite not being somebody who's super into science fiction, it seems like it's something that kind of borders on being science fiction and fantasy. So that's something I'm excited for. I'm also excited for books 4 and 5, both coming this year. I already pre-ordered book 4 because I'm crazy that way. And I guess I don't really know what else to say about this. So I know that they're big books. I was hoping at some point to be able to fit Empire of Silence into my schedule a little bit later in 2021, in between a few books when I had like a week of time to spare, but they're just too big, man. They're too big to fit into a week for me. I read way too slow, so I'll be able to fit them in at some point in time. It'll probably be closer to when that final book comes out. And coming in at number 4 is the Seven Realms series by Cinda Williams Chima. These covers are super, super, super cool. I love the way they look. Like, they're so simplistic. It's a similar kind of design as several other series I've seen are. They just look really cool. I think I read the first half of the first book in probably like 8th grade or freshman year or something like that, when I was really getting into a really rough spot. I do fully intend to read the series at some point in time. So yeah, there's that at number 4. And now we start going into the top 3, some big heavy hitters here. Number 3 is The Faithful and the Fallen series by John Gwynne. And I've seen a lot of praise for this series for so many different reasons. Like, the covers look awesome, and I've heard that the pacing and everything in the books is incredible. I've only heard a few people ever say bad things, and those were people who were just like, yeah, it's not for me. But that seems like very few people feel that way. Most people I've heard talk about the series really like it, which seems really cool. So And I know that there's another series in the world, whatever that's called, I forget what it's called, and then he's written one or two other books besides that have really cool covers that I've seen. I'm interested in all of these, but I've got to start with Faithful and the Fallen first, so that's my number 3 entry. At number 2 is A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. There's not a whole lot to say here in this section. This is a legendary series. It has a legendary TV show with a legendarily bad ending, and these covers are super cool in a way that I like. Like a lot of these series that I like the covers for the best, a lot of them have the simplistic style like this, where it's just like an item on the cover and one simple color scheme and everything. So I really like the way it looks. I will probably watch the TV series before I ever start reading the books, because the TV series is complete and the book series is not complete. I know that the TV show ends really bad. My understanding is that the reason for that is because the writers of the show deviated from the books a lot towards the end, and that's why it ended so bad. Which, you know what? Sounds like that would be a pretty decent reason for the series to end off badly. But I will probably watch the series before I read the books, because I do not want to read these books before the series is finished. Everybody I talk to says that it is worth reading the series right now despite it not being finished, but man, I am so not attracted to incomplete series. Like, for example, the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. I am perfectly fine reading the first arc of that at some point in time when the 5th book comes out, because the whole arc will be complete. But even when I start reading his stuff and he's writing the second arc of that and a book comes out every few years, I'll probably still be fine reading those, because Brandon is consistent enough of a writer that I can trust that the books will come out, and I'm completely fine waiting a little bit in between books. With these books, it's been forever since one of these A Song of Ice and Fire books has come out, and there is still not even a speculative release date for this 6th book, I think, maybe. And then there's another one after that, which who knows if or when that one, or even this one, will be released before George unfortunately dies. So if George ever gets around to finishing this series, I will read it. Up until then, I really, 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 really want to read the series. I'm just not interested right now while it is still so uncertain about being complete. So sorry to a bunch of all the fans and whatnot who, I'm sure want more people to read the series, despite it not being finished. I just cannot right now. And before we get into the number 1 pick, I want to talk about some honorable mentions. Now, most of these are on here for very good reasons, so continue to listen to these. One of them, the first honorable mention pick, is the Vampire Academy series by Rochelle Mead. This is a series with 6 books in it. I have actually read the first 4 books before, back in like my junior high years. So I was probably a bit too young and naive to be reading those books when I did, but a little too late for that now. So this is definitely a vampire series that exists in it definitely airs more on the side of the sexy vampire genre rather than the scary vampire genre. But based on what I know of either side of that vampire genre story, this is some of the best vampire stuff that has come out of the sexy vampire series or genre that I personally know of. Like, the classic example is Twilight. Hate Twilight. I could not finish that first book. It was awful, and you couldn't force me to watch those movies if you paid me like $15 trillion per movie. No, I'm good. But for some reason, I really liked Vampire Academy, because there were a lot of good ideas and concepts that were used in it that at the time that I started reading the series, I had never heard of or thought of before, and it just made it seem so much cooler to read at some point in time. So I have read 2/3 of it. That's why it's primarily only an honorable mention. So even though this is a pretty high priority series, all things considered, in the relativity of this list, it is only an honorable mention because I have already read 2/3 of it, but I will be finishing it at some point in time. So the next honorable mention is the Maze Runner series by James Dashner. I've read the Maze Runner, and I read a little bit of the Scorch Trials before it was that 8th grade freshman year kind of situation again. I read the first book. I absolutely loved it. I loved The Maze Runner when I read it. And I actually watched the Maze Runner's movie adaptation before I read the book. I know a lot of people who were big fans of the books that hated that movie. But because I watched that movie before I read the book, I loved that movie as a movie. And even though it's a little bit messy as an adaptation, based on the book that I know of, it's still a good movie, even if it messes some things up as an adaptation. So I was quickly, early on, able to separate those storylines pretty easily, which made experiencing the movies a lot better. So I've watched all three movies, actually, loved all three of them. They were really cool, really good movies. And I never finished reading the book series, so I definitely want to be able to read the series at some point as well, because, I mean, if everybody really likes the book series and nobody likes the movies that much as adaptations, the books have got to be good too in their own way. So I really want to reread and finish that series. The third honorable mention in the list is 11 Thumps by Obert Sky. I think that's how you pronounce his name. This is a really weird and random entry in a way, because this is a book series that I've owned all my life. I read the first couple books in like 7th or 8th grade or something like that, and I enjoyed them plenty. Definitely a very unique series. There's a lot of ideas and a lot of concepts and a lot of situations that characters get themselves into, and even a lot of characters themselves that are super weird, at least from what I remember. But I never disliked any of it. I just never finished the series. But I am ready at some point in time to revisit it and actually finish the series, because, I mean, the covers have always looked pretty cool to me, so there's that. The fourth honorable mention, and keep in mind there's 5 of these, so this is the fourth one, is Ranger's Apprentice by John Flanagan. I have a little bit of a checkered history with this series because I read the first 2 of them in like 6th grade. I couldn't finish book 3. When I tried to read book 3 like a couple different times over the next year or something like that, I couldn't finish it. It was just a really hard book to read for some reason. Then I finally restarted with book 1 a few years after that, in like probably the middle of high school, early high school, something like that. And I restarted with book 1, and I got all the way to book 6. And mind you, book 3 was still really hard to get through for some reason. There's just something about it that doesn't click with me. But I read through the first 6, and I loved almost everything. There's a lot of stuff about the series that I really, really, really love, and I really need to finish the series at some point in time. So there's that. And then the final honorable mention, sorry about that, is something that would have been on the list, probably in the top 5, is The Dark Tower by Stephen King. Now, the reason this is not in the list, or in the main list, and is only an honorable mention here, is because at this time, I am currently reading the series. This video is coming out on January 31st. I have finished The Gunslinger. I finished the first book in that series, and I will be finished with the series by the end of July or so, is what I have everything scheduled out to be. So, that's the reason this is an honorable mention, is because I'm actually currently reading it. So it's not like I haven't read this series but plan to. No, I am reading this series right now. So that's all I have to say about that. And now, finally, we get to my number 1 pick. And anybody watching this series who is part of the Discord server that I'm also part of is probably wondering why this series has been absent. It is The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. The reason the series has been absent on the list so far is because it's number 1. It was the very last thing I was going to talk about. In junior high and high school, my high school library got the whole series in the mass market paperback editions with the original covers. And I fell in love with these covers. Like, there's some of the most attractive covers I've ever seen in the world for some reason. There's just something about them that is so magical to me. So this is easily one of the most... how do I put this? This is one of the fantasy series that I've wanted to read the most for the past several years. I really don't know what else to say without putting in a bunch of fillers. I now own the series in hardcover with the original covers, which I'm so happy about because I love these covers so much. And I actually know exactly when I'm going to be reading them. In May of 2023 is when I'm going to be starting with The Wheel of Time. And then I'll be reading 1 book every 2 months, henceforth after that. So it'll take until about September 2025 to read them. The reason I'm doing that is because they're big, thick books, and some of them I know can be a little bit sloggy, especially in the middle of the series, and because of the length and those kinds of factors and stuff, reading one book every single month is going to take a lot out of me. I'm somebody who has trouble reading a lot of stuff in the same series, back to back to back. So even if I finish a book in a month, I want to be able to have some time off in between entries. So it is a series that's going to take me a bit to read, but I'm super excited to start reading it. And I did mention earlier that I would be talking a little bit more about why I'm not reading The Cosmere yet by Brandon Sanderson, and this is where I'll talk about it here. Since Brandon Sanderson finished the Wheel of Time series after Robert Jordan's death, I will be reading these last 3 books, obviously, in the Wheel of Time final, which will give me a little bit of an idea of how Brandon Sanderson writes, and it'll probably be after that when I actually start reading The Cosmere. I do want to read The Cosmere, but I want to read The Wheel of Time more, and I want to read The Wheel of Time sooner. So since Brando Sando wrote the last 3 books in this series, I will be starting The Cosmere later after that. I don't know if it'll be immediate, but it'll be sometime after I finish The Wheel of Time when I read The Cosmere. So that's my list. This is the conclusion. Thanks for sticking with me through it. I know it's a little bit of a long video, but hey, there was a lot of series that I wanted to talk about here, so I'm excited to be able to get a lot more into the fantasy genre since I'm not super well versed in it at this point in time. So thank you to everybody who watched. If you have some other suggestions, let me know. If you have some sci-fi series that you want to let me know about to check out or to perhaps spark my interest in, you can leave those suggestions as well, because I don't know much science fiction. And if you want to read my fantasy series called The Reign of Ash Sequence, also known as Silent Reign, you can find that on seasonalproductions.com/novels. Please go there and check that out. It's some of the stuff that I'm most excited to do. It'll be my life's work, basically. So the first 4 chapters of the first book are available up right now, and then in 2 days on Wednesday, chapter 5 comes out. There will be a new chapter every single Wednesday. So if you're interested in that, please go check it out, but keep in mind that it's all first draft, rough draft form. So there's going to be some issues with it, but I hope you go read it and enjoy it. So I think that's the end of this video. I don't think I have anything more that I need to talk about, so I won't waste any more of your time. I will see you guys next week with another episode of the Book Binge.